Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. I've got a big case for you today. This is a murder that literally changed the face of Britain for good. It led to a huge overhaul in policing and brought the institutional, systematic racism of the Metropolitan Police Force to the forefront. Stephen Lawrence's legacy changed everything. If you live in Britain, you've probably heard his name. You probably know the basics of his story. This took place in 1993 and it still hits the news on a regular basis today, thanks to Stephen's parents who always refused to give up on getting justice for their son. I think this is a story that should be known around the entire world. This is a mother that took on an entire establishment that just didn't want to listen. Stephen Lawrence was born on the 13th September 1974 in southeast London to Neville and Doreen Lawrence, who had emigrated to the UK from Jamaica in the 1960s. He had two younger siblings, Stuart and Georgina, and the family grew up in Plumstead, London. They were a religious family. Stephen was brought up attending the Trinity Methodist Church in Woolwich, and they considered religion, tolerance and education to be the most important tools in life, and that's how Stephen was raised. Neville was a carpenter, upholsterer, tailor and plasterer, a jack of all trades, whilst Doreen was a special needs teacher. Stephen was the oldest child and excelled at school. He was just one of those annoying people who was just good at everything. He was naturally smart and he didn't need to try particularly hard in school to get good grades. His brother would later say that no matter how well he did in life, Stephen was just always that little bit better. It was just the kind of person he was. At the age of 7, Stephen had decided that he was going to be an architect when he grew up, and not once over the years did he ever deviate from this path. Up until the day he died at 18, he still had his sights set on becoming a successful architect and was getting ready for years of training ahead of him. At age 16, he set up a small business with his friends and he designed and sold clothes inspired by well-known bands, rappers and politicians. Stephen loved music, particularly soul and R&B. At the time of his death in 1993, he was studying for his A-levels in English, craft, design and technology and physics at Blackheath Bluecoat Church of England School, and he was planning to go to university to study architecture. This is a boy who would have had a very successful life. He had the drive, he had the brains, he had the ambition. He never had been in any kind of trouble in his entire life, not even really with his parents or the law. This was a very good kid. But all of that was taken away from him on Thursday, the 22nd of April in 1993. After school that day, he decided to go to Lewisham to have a look around the shops before taking a bus to Plumstead to visit his uncle, where he was joined by his best friend, Dwayne Brooks. Dwayne and Stephen had met on their first day of secondary school at age 11, and by the time they were 18, they were just the best of friends. At Stephen's uncle's house, the two of them played computer games until it was time to go home. The first bus they caught from his uncle's house would have got them home too late, so they decided to swap buses at Well Hall Road in Eltham, southeast London. It would have just got them home a little bit quicker if they switched buses here, so that's what they decided to do. It's about 10:30 p.m. and they're waiting at the bus stop in Eltham, and Stephen makes the decision to cross the road to see if the bus was coming. It was a little bit late. As Stephen does this, Dwayne notices a group of 5 or 6 white teenagers also on the opposite side of the road. He calls out to Stephen to ask if the bus was on the way, and one of these teenagers overhears. This teenager begins shouting racist obscenities. I don't feel like I need to say the words he was shouting, but you can probably take a good guess. Within seconds, this entire group of teenagers had approached and engulfed Stephen. There were 3 witnesses at the bus stop, plus Dwayne. All of them said the attack was sudden, it ended as fast as it began, and one of the witnesses at the bus stop was somebody who actually knew Stephen. He was a neighbour. It was 10:30 p.m, it was dark, the street lights didn't exactly light the scene well, and not a single one of these people could later positively identify any of the attackers. One of this group had stabbed Stephen twice with a knife, once in the right collarbone and once in the left shoulder. Each wound was 5 inches deep and severed major arteries before penetrating a lung. Stephen began losing blood at an incredibly fast rate as the attackers ran away as quickly as they appeared. The attack lasted literally seconds. Stephen managed to get up despite having lost all feeling in his right arm and having very constricted breathing, and he ran 130 yards before collapsing. Adrenaline had given him the ability to get up and run before his body reacted to the physical injuries. The pathologist later said, It is surprising that he managed to get 130 yards with all of the injuries he had, but also the fact that the deep penetrating wound of the right side caused his upper lobe to partially collapse his lung. It is therefore a testimony to Stephen's physical fitness that he was able to run that distance he did before collapsing. Dwayne naturally chased after his friend, wanting to help, but Stephen fell to the ground. He could see under the street lamps that Stephen was drenched in blood, and he spots a public telephone directly across the road, so Dwayne runs right over and dials 999, telling them that his friend had been hit around the head with what he thought was an iron crowbar. As he waits for the emergency services to turn up, Dwayne tries to flag down passing cars, not that there were many on the road at 10:30 p.m. No one stops to help him, but luckily a couple, Connor and Louise Taff, were walking home from a prayer meeting at the local church. They stopped and knelt down next to Stephen to help him. In this time, the bus had arrived at the bus stop. The three people who were waiting there had boarded the bus and had gone on their way. Things had happened so fast, and it would later become clear that these three witnesses thought it was nothing more than a rumble between this group of boys. They probably thought that Stephen knew these boys. Nobody had seen Stephen get stabbed, and he'd got up and run away so quickly that even at this point, Dwayne was still under the impression that Stephen had simply been hit around the head, although he obviously knew that it was a serious injury by this point. Dwayne did also manage to flag down a passing car, and another couple stopped to help, and this just happened to be off-duty police officer James Geddes and his wife Angela, who were also just happening to be returning from a prayer meeting. James asked Dwayne if an ambulance was on its way, and Dwayne said he tried, but he didn't know exactly where they were. He didn't know if the 999 operator had gotten the right place. So James heads over to the phone and speaks to the operator himself and confirms that help is on its way. By 10:50 p.m, help arrives, but it's not an ambulance. A police car turns up. Dwayne was angry. He was reportedly shouting, "Where's the fucking ambulance? I didn't call the police." The officers didn't deal well with Dwayne at the scene. They would describe him later as being very agitated, jumping up and down, and being very aggressive. I can't imagine the bystanders at any crime scene are often calm and collected though, but Dwayne was angry because he felt like his friend was dying in front of his eyes and help still hadn't turned up. The officers made their way to Stephen and tested his pulse, finding it to be very faint. They checked his head as well for signs of a head wound, as Dwayne had reported, but they found none there. They could see the blood, obviously, as Stephen was saturated in it by this point, but didn't actually check for any other wounds. Stephen was wearing about 5 layers of clothes, it was cold, and they didn't strip him and check. As Stephen's lying on the floor, it's clear that he's struggling to hold on. Louise Taff puts her hand on Stephen's head and whispers in his ear, "You are loved, you are loved." There's a really good chance that these are the last words that Stephen ever heard. The police officers didn't know what to do. The ambulance wasn't usually this far behind them, so one of the officers decides to drive towards Woolwich to see if there was a problem on the road that might be causing the delay. And as this officer left, another police car arrived. At no point did any of the officers on the scene attempt to administer any form of first aid to Stephen, although they had all been on first aid courses. The two remaining officers at the scene focused their attention solely on Dwayne, asking him to share the details of what had happened. He obliges and provides them with his own and Stephen's details, and it seems like they were more interested in questioning Dwayne than actually tending to Stephen, who's on the floor dying. At 10:54 p.m, the ambulance finally arrives. The paramedic on board examines Stephen and finds no vital signs at all. No pulse, no heartbeat, no respiration. By this point, Stephen's heart had stopped. He was technically dead, but they put him on a stretcher and load him straight into the ambulance. Everything was covered in blood. He'd been lying in a pool of it. They headed off to the hospital at 11:03 p.m, and the paramedics spent the journey trying to restart his heart. Dwayne wanted to join Stephen in the ambulance, but one of the officers persuaded him that he'd be better off following behind in the police car with her. The entirety of this situation, from the moment the police officers arrived, was a farce. The first two officers arrived did check for Stephen's pulse to check if he was alive, but they failed to actually check what his injuries were. One of the officers that arrived was actually an inspector, and they said that when they arrived they simply took it for granted that one of the other officers had taken charge of his care. And there was no note or record made of what actually happened at the scene in live time. And they didn't immediately go out and search for his attackers, despite Dwayne telling them that Stephen had been attacked by a group of white teenagers. There should have been house-to-house searches done in the area the teenagers ran off to, but the police apparently thought it was too late to wake people up. The journey to Brook Hospital took just 3 minutes for the ambulance, and Stephen was taken immediately to the resuscitation room, where his clothes were cut away and efforts were made to restart his heart and respirate him. A surgeon and a nurse go out to speak to Dwayne to find out what had happened, and they find that Stephen's parents, Doreen and Neville, had already arrived. It was pure chance that Doreen and Neville found out as quickly as they did that Stephen had been hurt. Someone called Joey Shepherd was a neighbour of the Lawrences, and he just happened to be one of the 3 witnesses at the bus stop. He'd seen Stephen being attacked. He goes home and tells his father what he'd seen, and the two decide to head to the Lawrences' house to tell them immediately that Stephen may have been hurt. Joey didn't know how bad it was, but he knew what he'd seen. He'd seen something. So Doreen calls 999 to find out what was going on, but they tell her there'd been no such incident recorded. By this point, when Doreen was on the phone to 999, the ambulance had just turned up at Stephen's side, so it's possible there was a delay there. Doreen had been waiting up for Stephen to get in. She said she wouldn't usually go to bed until he got in, and 10:30 p.m. was his curfew. So she immediately throws on her coat and decides to head to the scene where Stephen had been injured, but there was nobody there. So they decide to head to the hospital. They were initially relieved when Stephen wasn't waiting in A&E, but then Neville recognised Dwayne and asked him what had happened. It was at that point that the surgeon and the nurse appear, asking questions. Doreen asks if she can see her son and is told that they're working on him before being shown to a family waiting room. What they weren't told is that by that point their son was already dead. After about 10 minutes, a doctor and a nurse come in and tell them the news. Dwayne is also sitting in there with them. Doreen and Neville go in to see their son's body for the last time, whilst Dwayne remains in the family room. At 11:30 p.m, Dwayne was spoken to by PC Gleason, who recorded his statement in his notebook. This was the first recorded account of the attack and included a light description of at least one of the attackers. Dwayne said that one of them had light brown hair. The later inquest would show that throughout this entire time, throughout the questioning that lasted half an hour, Dwayne was not treated as a victim, which he was. He was treated as a criminal himself, told that he wasn't allowed to leave, that he had to either wait in the hospital or the police car. According to a BBC documentary I watched on this topic, Dwayne immediately told the officers that this was a racist attack, that the group who had done this had been shouting racial obscenities. But the officers immediately suspected Dwayne, that perhaps him and Stephen had been fighting and it had just gone too far. For no reason other than just pure racial stereotyping, they assumed that drugs were involved, or at least some kind of crime was involved here. Stephen had a single glove on him at the time he died, which apparently to the police indicated that he was involved in something dodgy. Definitely not that it was a cold evening. I mean, like, Stephen was wearing 5 layers of clothes. It's not crazy that he'd have gloves on him as well. And this could also be why the police didn't bother to chase after or go searching for this group. A huge amount of racial profiling was involved in the crucial first moments of this investigation. Dwayne decides to wait in the police car and is eventually taken to the police station to give a formal statement. And that commences at 1:30 a.m. and ends at 5:30 a.m. He said that he was given the option to go home before he gave the statement. He just decided to do it there and then. The detective who took his statement would note that Dwayne was remarkably together and intelligent. The statement was clear and comprehensive. It seems that he was treated well at the station at least, although it was requested by the police that he had a photograph of himself taken for the police records. Not a single other witness at the scene was asked to provide a photo then or later. Only Dwayne. Why? Why on earth did the police need a photo of him? He worried that this implied that they were looking at him as a suspect. I mean, this just caused unnecessary worry and stress. This is an 18-year-old boy who is a victim of a crime and is kind of being treated like a criminal. And the liaison he was provided afterwards was overall inadequate. He was just never looked after properly in the aftermath of the ordeal and was never given any victim support. The later inquest concluded that Dwayne was treated differently than a white boy would have been at the scene. He was stereotyped as a young black man exhibiting unpleasant hostility and agitation, whose condition did not need further examination or understanding. With Stephen dead, the obvious next step was for the police to open an investigation into his murder. They managed to identify all 3 witnesses at the bus stop at the time of the attack and take their statements. All said that it was a sudden and short, unprovoked attack, and none of them were able to identify any of the attackers. The word gets out about Stephen's death, and over the next couple of days, detectives received 26 tip-offs, many of which included the very same names. Just the day after the murder, a notice found in a local telephone box that gave a list of 4 names that this note said was definitely involved in the murder. There was also another anonymous note left on a police car with similar information. Both notes named Neil Aycourt, Jamie Aycourt, David Norris and Gary Dobson as involved. Other tips also named a 5th person, Luke Knight. Every one of these boys was 16 or 17 years old. They were a local gang and were well known to be openly racist. They were also known for always carrying knives around with them. With such a huge amount of tips coming in about the same people, they could have been arrested immediately and put into identity parades whilst witness memories were still fresh. But they weren't. Despite the fact that the police were watching these boys, and at one point an officer watches Jamie Aycourt leave his house with a full black bin bag, get into his car and drive away. This may have been something totally innocent, of course, or this bin bag may have been full of evidence that he was going to dispose of. We'll never know because the police didn't do anything. Of course, Stevens wasn't the only racially motivated murder that happened in Greenwich in recent years. He was actually the 3rd. The Greenwich area at this time in the 90s, Eltham, Mottingham, Plumstead, etc., saw racist violence often. The ethnic minority population in this area at the time was approximately 13%. A relatively small number, not enough for there to be strength in numbers, but enough black and Asian people that the white majority took notice. There was also a high level of poverty in this area, and we all know that people love to blame other ethnicities for their sufferings. It's a cop-out, an easy explanation. Blame the immigrants. Greenwich was one of the racist hotspots of the country at the time, with hundreds of incidents of racial harassment being reported to the police just in this one area every single year. It was normal that people of colour in this area of London in the early 90s would be subjected to racism. And this just fueled Stephen. This made him even more determined to succeed in his life goals, and that couldn't happen for him. On Monday the 26th of April, 4 days after the murder, Detective Superintendent Brian Whedon says that no arrests had taken place yet because there just wasn't enough evidence. Apparently, at this point, he simply didn't know that the law did allow arrest upon reasonable suspicion. This is the Detective Superintendent of the London Metropolitan Police. You would hope that he'd know this very basic point of criminal law. You can arrest somebody under reasonable suspicion. But he didn't. By the 4th of May, the police still hadn't done anything. Doreen and Neville Lawrence hold a press conference and complain that nothing is being done about their son's death. No effort is being made to catch the killers, even though they already have some very strong names. 2 days later, Neville and Doreen meet Nelson Mandela, who happened to be on a visit to Britain at the time. And it was only when Mandela spoke publicly about Stephen's plight were the police embarrassed into arresting the suspects. So the very next day, on the 7th of May 1993, police raid the homes and arrest Neil and Jamie Aycourt, brothers, and Gary Dobson. In the raids, they find a number of weapons, including knives, in the houses. When questioned, the Aycourts say they have nothing to say, responding no comment to everything. Gary Dobson, however, had plenty to say. He'd already told the police, you see, that he'd been at home on the night that Stephen was murdered. But witnesses came forward saying that he'd seen Dobson at the Aycourts' house late that night, that him, Dobson and Norris were all there cleaning themselves up. Dobson has no choice but to change his story, saying that he just popped out just before midnight to borrow a CD from a friend. He also completely denied knowing David Norris, but they had been photographed together just a few days before. If he's innocent, why is he telling so many lies? On the 10th of May, 3 days later, David Norris hands himself into the police and is arrested. On the 13th, Dwayne Brooks picks Neil Aycourt out of an identity parade and he's charged with the murder. 3 weeks later, Luke Knight is arrested at his home on Wellhall Road. That's right, he lived on the same road that the murder had taken place on. He's also charged with murder. But just 6 days later, on the 29th of June 1993, the Crown Prosecution Service drops the charges, citing insufficient evidence. Apparently, the ID evidence from Dwayne was just unreliable. In August, the Met Police set up a review of their own investigation, and surprisingly, they don't find much. And in December, the inquest is halted after the family's barrister, Michael Mansfield, say there was dramatic new evidence. Despite this new evidence, the CPS still refused to prosecute, believing it still to be insufficient. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service just seemed to be really dragging their heels. They did not want to charge these people. But the Lawrences were determined not to give up. This lit a fire under Doreen. She was going to get justice for her son, and she didn't know it at the time, but she was going to change the entire inner workings of the Metropolitan Police while she did so. Most murder charges are generally made on behalf of everybody by the Crown Prosecution Service, but it is possible for individuals to make charges privately, and whilst it's very rare, that's exactly what the Lawrences did in April 1994, 1 whole year after the murder of their son. Imagine the frustration of that year. You've literally got 5 names who are very, very obviously strong suspects in this case, and the police aren't doing anything about it. They initiated a private prosecution against all 5 suspects, all of whom denied the charges. A private prosecution is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same as when it's brought on by the CPS. The family were not entitled to legal aid though, and so had to establish a fund to pay for the proceedings and for the analysis of forensic evidence. They were represented by Michael Mansfield, as I said, who agreed to work for them pro bono. Over the next couple of years, all of the evidence was handed over to the Lawrences, including a scathing new piece of evidence which had come to light around December 1994. The police had bugged Gary Dobson's flat with a tiny camera in a plug socket, and the footage showed Dobson with a knife and also captured him using racist slurs, being generally incredibly racist, and reenacting attacks that he'd made on black people. The same footage showed Acord in Dobson's flat with a knife on him at all times. Inexplicably, he's just always holding a knife. David Norris is captured on camera saying, "If I was going to kill myself, do you know what I'd do? I'd go and kill every black, every racial slur for a Pakistani person, every mug, every copper that I know." And he goes on to explain in a lot of detail about how he would torture and kill black people. So, you know, this is a clearly very racist group of teenagers. I mean, remember their ages. They're barely 18 by this point in time. They were 16 and 17 when they killed Stephen. Eventually, the charges against Jamie Acord and David Norris are dropped for a lack of evidence, but the trial goes ahead for the other 3, beginning on the 17th of April 1996. But by the 25th, the entire case had collapsed after the judge had ruled that the ID evidence from Dwayne Brooks was inadmissible. A police officer had spoken in court about how when they were driving home from the ID parade, Dwayne had told him that he was unsure about who he had picked out. Although today, Dwayne still maintains that he correctly identified both Neil Acord and Luke Knight in the lineups. But when Dwayne spoke on the stand, he just fell apart, and so he was ruled unreliable as a witness. Although incredibly frustrating, a later inquiry did confirm that the judge came to the correct conclusion here with the evidence that he had. As a result, all 3 men are formally acquitted, and they leave court with the knowledge that they can never be retried again because of Britain's double jeopardy law of the time. The double jeopardy law prevented a person from being tried again for the same crime once they've already been acquitted, even if new evidence emerges or if they later confess. I mean, this law does have an important reason for existing. It prevents the abuse of state power. It stops police and prosecutors from repeatedly investigating and prosecuting the same individual for the same crime. But only the issue in Stephen's case was that the police didn't do their job properly in the first place. And that was one of the main reasons that the case just couldn't stand up in court. In February 1997, an inquest was held into Stephen's death, with the 5 suspects still refusing to answer any questions, claiming privilege against self-incrimination, despite the fact that for 3 of them, double jeopardy meant they could never be prosecuted again, even if they confessed. The inquest concluded on the 13th of February with the jury returning a verdict after just 30 minutes that this was an unlawful killing in a completely unprovoked racist attack by 5 white youths. And despite everything that had happened, Stephen's case being all over the news for months, for years by this point, not once had any of these 5 suspects ever been publicly named because they were underage when the crime was committed. Now, it's not often that you will ever hear me say anything positive about the Daily Mail, especially nowadays, because they are just the scum of media. But I do have to put my hands up and admit that they did lead a remarkable campaign in getting justice for Stephen Lawrence. Although saying that, the Daily Mail editor Paul Dacra did admit that he would never have run the stories that he did had he not known Neville Lawrence personally. See, Neville had actually performed apparently an amazing job in plastering Paul's house. Paul was quoted as saying he did a lot of plastering work. He was clearly a very decent, hard-working man. Would the male have done it without that knowledge? Probably not. On February 14th, 1997, the Daily Mail ran the front page with the headline, "Murderers. The Mail accuses these men of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us." It showed photos and named each of the 5 suspects for the first time ever, urging them to take legal action if they were indeed innocent. This headline was hugely controversial and prompted extraordinary political debate. Was this the right thing to do? The next day, the Mail revealed the damning video evidence of the boys inside Dobson's flat, the racism and the knives and the reenacting attacks. The Prime Minister, John Major, actually had to come forward and say that the Daily Mail had broken no laws with their coverage of this case. And it turns out that none of the men actually came forward to sue them for defamation, and a strong public opinion begins to form against the accused and the police's handling of the case. On 31st of July 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw announces another inquiry, a judicial inquiry into this case, that was to this time be headed up by retired High Court Judge Sir William Macpherson. This would go on to be known as the Macpherson Inquiry or Macpherson Report. The inquiry was to begin the following March of 1998, and the judge was to be shown everything. Now down below I'll be linking the entire Macpherson report if anybody wants to take a look. It's incredibly long and detailed, as you would expect. This report looks into everything. It looks into the treatment of Dwayne Brooks, the treatment of Neville and Doreen. It looks into the investigation after Stephen's death and the institutional racism within the Met Police that affected everything that came after. And whilst I've tried, I just cannot summarise and do it justice in this video. When I say the Met Police was racist at the time, it's not me being sensitive or a social justice warrior, so many of you like to call me. It was proven undoubtedly by the Macpherson report. And as a result of this report, the entire force enacted huge change from the top down. I will read this one excerpt though, which I think summarises the report pretty well. It reads, "Unwitting racism can arise because of lack of understanding, ignorance or mistaken beliefs. It can arise from well-intentioned but patronising words or actions. It can arise from unfamiliarity with the behaviour or cultural traditions of people or families from minority ethnic communities. It can arise from racist stereotyping of black people as potential criminals or troublemakers. Often this arises out of uncritical self-understanding born out of an inflexible police ethos of the traditional way of doing things. Furthermore, such attitudes can thrive in a tightly knit community, so that there can be a collective failure to detect and to outlaw this breed of racism. The police canteen can too easily be its breeding ground." Macpherson also wrote that the failure of the first investigating team to recognise and accept racism and race relations as a central feature of this investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence played a part in the deficiencies of policing. A substantial number of junior rank officers who were directly involved with the early stages of this investigation refused to believe that this murder was simply and solely racially motivated. Simply, the relevance of the ethnicity and cultural status of the victims, including Stephen obviously, Dwayne and Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence, was not properly recognised. As the inquiry went on, the Assistant Police Commissioner said that he was very sorry to have let the Lawrence family down. Meanwhile, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon, apologises to the Lawrence family, but denies that the force was institutionally racist. In July, the suspects were all called to give evidence to this inquiry, which they do. As they leave, all 5 boys are cocky, knowing that no matter what they said, they cannot be charged again. And as they leave the courtroom, the public pelt them with bottles and they have to flee the scene pretty quickly. The report was published on the 24th February 1999, Macpherson ending the report with a list of 70 recommendations to improve practices within the Metropolitan Police. But it didn't just stop there. The report even made recommendations to changes in the national curriculum that could prevent racial prejudice and foster cultural diversity, as well as saying that racist incidents in schools should be reported to pupils' parents and a record should be published by each school every year. It was noted particularly that they needed to re-establish the trust between minority ethnic communities and the police. It was well known within the minority communities that junior officers would discriminate at an operational level, and then they would blindly support each other in the discrimination. The public had no trust in the police, especially these minority communities. The police investigation into Stephen Lawrence's murder was marred by a combination of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership by senior officers. Within 2 years, 67 of the 70 recommendations had produced specific changes in practice or law in the UK. So many of these changes are now taken for granted. It's because of the Macpherson report that the police are now very strongly obligated to investigate hate crimes. It's the reason you can't just go around spewing racism and pretend it's okay because you have freedom of speech. The Macpherson report said no, that's not acceptable. This was a small win for the Lawrences, but they didn't really get what they wanted, which was justice for their son. No one had been jailed for his death. These 5 people were still walking free. In 2002, both David Norris and Neil Acorte were both jailed for a racist attack on a plainclothes police officer. Norris had thrown a drink and shouted racist abuse at Detective Constable Gareth Reed, a black man, as he walked home from the station one night. 9 years on from Stephen's death, and their attitudes and racism clearly hadn't changed. And this offence took place just half a mile away from where Stephen was murdered, on the very same road even. Each man was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with a minimum of 9 months behind bars. Throughout these years as well, Gary Dobson had also been arrested or charged a number of times for smaller offences such as theft and burglary, but none of them led to his imprisonment until a drugs charge in 2010, at which point he was jailed for 5 years. And then in 2005, there was a huge change in the law. As part of the findings of the Macpherson report, it had been recommended that the rule against double jeopardy should be repealed in murder cases, and that it should be possible to subject an acquitted murder suspect to a second trial if fresh and viable new evidence came to light. This recommendation was implanted within the Criminal Justice Act 2003 and came into full force in April 2005. This was a beacon of hope for Doreen Lawrence, but they needed undeniable new evidence in order for the Court of Appeal to agree to quash the original acquittal. But now there's a chance of something new happening in this case. Before it was just gone, there was nothing they could do. A cold case review commences in July 2006. This was done in secret, kept away from the media. They wanted to make sure they had something big, but they didn't want the suspects to know that they were coming for them. Around the same time, a BBC documentary is released alleging police corruption in the Lawrence case. We already know about all the racism, but now it was suggested that the father of David Norris, Clifford Norris, might have actually been paying a former detective sergeant for information about the investigation. Clifford was a successful mid-level drug dealer who was said to have had his hooks in several police officers within the Met, although an independent police complaints commission the following year found no evidence of police corruption here. It wasn't until November 2007 that they finally confirmed they were investigating new forensic evidence, the most important of which consisted of a microscopic stain of Stephen's blood on the collar of Gary Dobson's jacket. There were also fibres from Stephen's clothing and hairs with a 99.9% chance of having come from Stephen found on both Dobson's jacket and David Norris's jeans. They were found now because of the huge leaps in forensics and technology since 1993. The clothes had originally been seized when they raided Dobson and Norris's homes before they were arrested back in '93. But it's a number of years before anything more happens in this case. Gary Dobson and David Norris aren't arrested and charged until the 8th of September 2010, and weeks later the Director of Public Prosecutions applied to the Court of Appeal for Dobson's original acquittal to be quashed. Norris hadn't been previously acquitted, so his case was a lot easier here. It was very straightforward. For legal reasons, reporting restrictions were put in place for these proceedings, pretty much to ensure that the media didn't mess anything up here. We know the media really like to get involved in the Lawrence case. They weren't taking any chances this time. Even the arrest wasn't reported. Gary Dobson's acquittal was quashed in April 2011, meaning that he could officially be retried. It was announced by the CPS that the two would now face trial for the murder in light of new and substantial evidence, in the form of forensics. It was stated that this new evidence, if reliable, would place Dobson in very close proximity indeed to Stephen Lawrence at the moment of and in the immediate aftermath of the attack, for which there could be no innocent explanation to be discerned. On 15th of November 2011, David Norris and Gary Dobson go on trial at the Old Bailey, charged with murdering Stephen Lawrence. This was pretty much the very last chance of the conviction of these two. Doreen Lawrence appeared at court every single day. In all of those years, she never gave up, even for a moment. The entire case pretty much hung on this new forensic evidence. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this singular bloodstain and these fibres meant that these boys were in the proximity of Stephen when he died. The defence, however, argued that this microscopic amount of blood on the collar of Dobson's jacket was caused by an old flake of blood being dissolved during saliva testing. They said that the evidence had been poorly handled in the aftermath of the investigation, with Stephen's own blood-stained jacket being placed in an unsealed package in the same overage as the package containing Dobson's jacket. Is it any surprise at this point that the evidence was mishandled by the police? It really isn't. But the defence argued that a tiny amount of dried blood transferred over from Stephen's clothes onto Gary's clothes, although they were technically in different packets, and subsequently set on the collar once it was saturated in the saliva testing. The prosecution rebuffed this, saying it was so unlikely that it was practically impossible. The defence also said that the fibres found on Dobson's jacket were the result of a tertiary transfer. Basically, Stephen transferred the fibres to the offender, and the offender, whoever it was, then transferred said fibres onto Dobson's jacket. And as for Norris and the hair and fibres found in his jeans, the defence said that the database they used to confirm if the hair was Stephen's or not was not representative of South East London, and that there would be a lot of coincidences if the hairs had not got there by contamination. The prosecution obviously said that the profile of the hair excluded literally everyone with the exception of Stephen Lawrence. Like, there was such a slim chance this hair would be somebody else's other than Stephen's. The defence also said that the fibres on Norris's jumper could have transferred when he visited the killer and picked up the fibres on his clothes. It wasn't really clear which way the jury was going to go in this case. The defence clearly had a very weak argument, but it was an argument nonetheless. Yes, it was practically impossible that a tiny blood flake could have set itself into the collar of Dobson's jacket, but there was that very slim chance, and really, people just weren't taking any chances here. They really didn't know which way this was going to go. But on the 3rd of January 2012, both Dobson and Norris were found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence after 3 days of deliberation, 19 years on. The next day, the two were sentenced to the equivalent to a life sentence for an adult, with a minimum term of 15 years and 2 months for Dobson and 14 years and 3 months for Norris. The judge said that the sentences reflected the fact they were both juveniles at the time of the offence. Therefore, the starting point for the minimum term was 12 years. The judge acknowledged that this might be lighter than some might expect, as the minimum sentence for the same crime committed by an adult would have been 30 years. Of course, both Dobson and Norris attempted to appeal their sentences, but they lost their first round, and it doesn't seem like there's been any new attempts since then. In June 2013, an interview with Peter Francis, a former undercover police officer, was published in The Guardian. He said that he was working undercover within an anti-racist campaign in the mid-90s. He says that he was constantly pressured by his superiors to smear the credibility of the Lawrence family as to end campaigns for a new investigation into Stephen's death. His superiors within the Met actively asked him to find the dirt on the family. Sadly for them though, there was no dirt on the Lawrence family. They were upstanding citizens, they were never on the wrong side of the law, and they were all round very good people. These same people, these same superiors, later withheld this information from the Macpherson report as well, so you won't find anything mentioned in there. Doreen would say this was one of the most surprising things about the police investigation, and that's saying something. She said, "Out of all of the things I've found out over the years, this certainly has topped it. Nothing can justify the whole thing about trying to discredit the family and the people around us." She said she had a feeling though back in 1993 that something was amiss, as she was baffled as to why family liaison officers would record the identities of everyone entering and leaving their household. Why would they need to do that? The truth is, the police were scared of the Lawrence family. Although they didn't want to admit it, they knew that racism was rife within the Met. They knew that they had messed up on this investigation, and they knew that it was going to turn around and bite them in the arse. The only choice the Met had at this point was to try and discredit the family as much as they could, so no one believed them when they spoke publicly. Only they really underestimated Doreen Lawrence. She is a superwoman, a credit to a mother's love for her children. After all of this came to light, Theresa May, who was the Home Secretary at the time, pledged to be ruthless about purging corruption from the police, and Prime Minister David Cameron ordered the police to investigate these allegations. Today, 26 years on, there's obviously still going to be corruption and racism within the Met, as there will be within any large organisation, but people are actively fighting it now. It's no longer accepted. This is Stephen's legacy. His death has probably inadvertently saved the lives of hundreds of others, and has completely changed the UK's attitude to racism and the police. That's a big thing for one death to do. Although he does have this incredible legacy though, Doreen and Neville Lawrence, who divorced in the late 90s, would prefer for their son to be alive, for none of this to have happened in the first place. They took their son's body back to Jamaica to be buried, saying that London didn't deserve him. Only close family know exactly where to find Stephen's grave. Today there's the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, which is set up by Doreen. It works with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to enable them to succeed in the career of their choice. They fight for a fairer society in which everyone, regardless of their background, can flourish. Whilst a lot has changed since Stephen's murder in '93, many things are still the same. Many people still struggle to succeed because they are disadvantaged by factors beyond their control, their birthplace, their skin colour, the school they go to. This trust provides educational and employability workshops and mentoring schemes, and always awards architectural and landscape bursaries. It helps people begin careers in architecture if that's what they desire, but obviously that was Stephen's biggest passion. And there's also the annual architectural award, the Stephen Lawrence Prize, established by the Marco Goldschmied Foundation in association with the Royal Institute of British Architects, in Stephen's memory. There's the Stephen Lawrence Centre in Deptford, South East London. There's a Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at De Montfort University, of which Doreen was appointed Chancellor of the University in January 2016. She also received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the 14th Pride of Britain Awards in October 2012. She was elevated to the peerage as a Baroness on the 6th September 2013, formally styled Baroness Lawrence of Clarendon in the Commonwealth realm of Jamaica, this very rare honour. She sits on the Labour benches in the House of Lords as a working peer specialising in race and diversity. On April 23, 2018, at a memorial service to mark the 25th anniversary of his death, Theresa May, now Prime Minister, announced that Stephen Lawrence Day would be an annual national commemoration of his death on the 22nd of April every year, starting in 2019. Doreen said that Stephen Lawrence Day would be an opportunity each year for young people to use their voices. This is an amazing legacy for one boy, for one murder. His attack lasted less than 10 seconds, and that 10 seconds changed the face of Britain forever. I hope that one day charges can be brought on the rest of the boys involved, but for now, just having someone, let alone two people, being held responsible for his death is something that the country and the Lawrences never thought would happen. And that's the legacy of Stephen Lawrence. He literally changed the face of Britain forever. Like I said earlier in the video, if you want to go read the Macpherson report, I will link it down below. I would highly recommend you read it. It really is very interesting, but it's pretty long, so you might need some time to do that. Let me know in the comments down below what videos you want to see from me. I know this is a really weird time for the world right now, with a lot of people being in isolation, a lot of countries noticing allowed to leave their houses. I have a feeling Britain's going to be going that way in probably the next few days. I can't believe we're not already. But I will still be here every single Wednesday posting content for you guys. I have history videos planned, I have my serial killer videos planned. I'm not going anywhere, so I suppose throughout all the isolation you can rely on YouTube to keep you sane. Even if it's not my channel, there are so many amazing channels out there, and I'm so grateful to every content creator for keeping me entertained during this time when, I mean, I haven't really left my house in a few days properly. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.